Think about the last time you pulled out a dollar bill. You probably didn't give it a second thought. You handed it over, got your coffee, and moved on with your day. That crumpled piece of green paper feels so natural, so ordinary, that it's almost impossible to imagine a version of America where it simply didn't exist. But for the first 86 years of the United States as an independent nation, there was no federally issued paper currency. None. Not a single government-printed dollar bill circulated through the economy. To understand why, we have to go back even further, to the early 1600s, when the first English settlers arrived on the eastern shore of North America. They stepped off their ships into a world with no banks, no mints, and no financial infrastructure of any kind. How does a civilization build the world's most powerful economy when they have to invent their money out of thin air? The answer is a chaotic, centuries-long journey through harvested tobacco leaves, strings of coastal clamshells, and the total collapse of the early financial system. Back in England, the economy ran on silver pennies, shillings, and pounds, but the British Crown actively prohibited the colonies from minting their own coins. The right to issue currency was inseparable from sovereignty, and England had no intention of granting its colonies independence. The colonists had goods to sell and land to work, but no medium of exchange. Whatever gold and silver coins they managed to bring from Europe were almost immediately sucked back across the Atlantic as payment for imported finished products. The first backup plan was pure barter. If you were a blacksmith who needed flour, but the miller didn't need horseshoes, you had to find someone who wanted horseshoes and had something the miller actually wanted. Arranging a three-way trade for basic survival was clumsy, slow, and restricted economic growth. This artificial scarcity left local businesses perpetually starved of hard currency. Stranded without a formal monetary system, the colonies were forced to improvise new mediums of exchange out of necessity. The colonists quickly realized that commodities everyone needed could function as informal currency. In Virginia, the colony officially designated tobacco as legal tender as early as 1619. You could pay your taxes with it, settle debts, and even buy a wife. When the Virginia Company shipped young women to the colony, the going rate was 120 pounds of tobacco per bride. Tobacco had significant physical flaws as currency. It was bulky, it rotted, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the harvest. A bumper crop could cause devastating overnight inflation, making a farmer's savings worth half of what they had been the season before. Further north, another alternative emerged. European traders co-opted wampum, carefully crafted shell beads used by indigenous peoples for diplomacy and ceremony, and turned it into a formal medium of exchange. From 1643 to 1660, wampum was explicitly declared legal tender in Massachusetts. But physical objects are inherently unstable. Tobacco rotted in warehouses, and with wampum, European tools made the beads far easier to mass-produce than traditional methods. This inflated the supply and destroyed the currency's value, eventually forcing the British to shut the whole arrangement down. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, a highly reliable foreign metal filled the void in American ports, the Spanish milled dollar. Minted from vast silver deposits in Mexico and South America, its consistent weight and purity made it a universal currency. English coins were so scarce that colonists modeled their commercial life entirely around these Spanish pieces of 8. When they needed exact change, they literally sliced the silver coin into halves, quarters, or eighths. Those eighths were called bits, which is where we get the expression 2 bits for a quarter. But foreign coins could only stretch so far. In 1690, Massachusetts launched a military expedition into Canada and found itself unable to pay its soldiers. The colonial treasury was empty, so the colony printed paper bills of credit, IOUs backed by a promise to accept them for future taxes. It worked initially, and other colonies took notice. By the time of the Revolution, 14 different colonies had printed their own disjointed paper currencies. Every colony issued notes with different denominations, exchange rates, and levels of trustworthiness. A Massachusetts pound was entirely different from a Pennsylvania pound. A note accepted in one town might be refused across the border. Without a unified backing, uncoordinated paper money became a drag on cross-border commerce. Then came the crisis of 1775. The Continental Congress was organizing an armed resistance against the British Empire. But the war effort required millions of dollars that Congress simply didn't have. Since they lacked the power to levy taxes, they couldn't raise the necessary funds. Congress turned to the printing press, authorizing millions in a new currency called the Continental Dollar. The bills were explicitly denominated in Spanish-milled dollars to signal to the public that they were meant to hold hard value. But Congress kept the printing presses running to keep its armies equipped. By 1779, millions in continental currency had flooded the economy. Prices skyrocketed, and by 1781, a continental traded at 1,000 to 1 against actual silver. Millions of farmers, soldiers, and shopkeepers were left holding worthless stacks of paper. This total economic ruin traumatized the founders, making the phrase "not worth a continental" synonymous with government failure and the collapse of public trust. When the Constitutional Convention assembled in 1787, the delegates were determined to prevent another national humiliation. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution explicitly prohibits the states from emitting bills of credit. The founders built the new system on a gold and silver standard, restricting legal tender to physical coin. The new United States Mint struggled to produce enough coinage. As the nation expanded and industrialized, farmers and manufacturers found there were simply not enough gold and silver coins in circulation to fund the growing economy. State-chartered private banks stepped in, printing notes redeemable for gold. This launched the free banking era. By the 1830s, merchants had to navigate over 8,000 distinct varieties of paper currency, trading at wildly different values based on the issuing institution's reputation. Unfamiliar notes and poor printing quality turned counterfeiting into a widespread practice. Fraudulent wildcat banks operated in remote areas, issuing impressive-looking notes before vanishing. Some corrupt bankers even filled kegs with nails and scrap iron, covering them with a thin layer of coins to trick inspectors into believing they held legitimate gold reserves. A farmer could sell his harvest for notes from what he assumed was a reputable bank, only to discover a month later it had closed. His entire season's income would turn to dust overnight. Privatizing the money supply without centralized regulation resulted in total dysfunction. A system lacking uniformity and oversight inevitably devolved into a market built on the word of men who were often liars and thieves. In 1861, the Civil War placed a financial burden on the government that exceeded the total federal spending of the previous 50 years. The massive demand for weaponry and supplies exhausted the supply of gold and outpaced the capacity of private banknotes to fund the conflict. On February 25, 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, creating the greenback. For the first time, the United States government issued paper money that was not a claim on gold or silver stored in a vault. Its value came solely from the law itself and the government's requirement that it be accepted. This note was detached from physical metal, carrying no guarantee of redemption in gold. It was a currency whose value relied on a declaration from the federal government that creditors were legally obligated to accept these pieces of paper to settle debts. Many feared this move would trigger another continental collapse, but the greenback survived. By 1862, the United States finally possessed the institutional power to levy income taxes and enforce tariffs, providing a credible revenue stream to backstop its own promises. The system established during the Civil War was permanent. In 1971, President Richard Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold, ending the final link between American paper money and precious metal. The modern dollar is no longer backed by gold or silver. It is supported by the full faith and credit of the United States government. This trust is currently being challenged by mounting national debt, fluctuating inflation, and the rise of decentralized digital currencies. These new technologies are forcing a debate over what money actually is and who should control it. The modern dollar is a product of an agonizing 2-century struggle to create collective trust out of nothing. Every bill is a monument to that history, a shared idea forged through 200 years of trial, failure, and necessity.